Hello and welcome to the final episode of Season 3. What an incredible journey it has been. A huge thank you to our amazing sponsors at Target Lifts, who have helped us take Stuck in a Lift all across the UK and even over to Sweden. We're wrapping up this season with two fantastic guests, the inspiring Tanni Grey-Thompson and the brilliant Ralph Smith, as we dive into an important conversation around accessibility. So grab a cuppa, get comfy and enjoy the episode.
Lift that's being put in for accessibility needs to be there because a box needs to be ticked for compliance.
I just want a lift that goes up and down and I can reach the buttons.
Doors closing. Welcome to the 13th floor. Stuck in a Lift HQ.
Welcome to the 13th and final episode of this season. It has been an incredible journey as we've travelled across the UK and even recently ventured over to Sweden. To wrap up the season, we're diving into an important discussion around disabled access in London. Joining me are two exceptional guests today. Over here, we've got the remarkable Baroness Grey-Thompson and well-known Ralph Smith from Vertica. Tanni will share her first-hand experiences navigating lifts across London, whilst Ralph is here to provide insights into the future of accessibility in lift design. Tanni, Ralph, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tanni, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience today?
I'm Tanni Grey-Thompson. I am Paralympian. I competed at 5 Paralympic Games. And I now sit in the House of Lords as a crossbench peer, which basically means we're independent. We're not affiliated to any parties.
Brilliant. And over to you, Ralph.
I'm Ralph Smith from Vertica Consulting, director and owner. Vertica are independent consultants. We work with clients and end users of lifts, giving them advice either from a new build perspective, modernisation, or from existing lifts in service.
Brilliant. Thank you. Tanni, over to you for the first question there. What specific challenges do you face with vertical transport in London and how could they be addressed?
So lifts are so important to me for like every part of my life. And if you look at the London Tube network, there's only about a third of the tubes which are accessible for me to get on to the train. And it's a really old network. So you kind of do recognise that, you know, that causes lots of problems. You know, when it was designed, it wasn't designed for probably women, let alone, disabled people. So the challenge of making the stations accessible is a tough one. So the 2012 Olympics and Paralympics were amazing and it gave London the chance to do things in a bit of a different way. So things like Green Park and King's Cross put lifts in, which is amazing, but they're expensive. I mean, not just the lifts, it's the fact all the work that goes around it. So they were something like 180 and 150 million to make that happen. But for me, it makes a massive difference. So in recent years, you know, Bond Street's now step-free, you know, Tottenham Court Road. So it's really exciting every time a station is made more accessible because it opens up this, you know, massive bit of London for me. You know, there's talks at the moment about Kensington having a lift, which would be amazing. But, you know, that's gone all the way to a public inquiry because putting the lifts in changes a lot of stuff around, you know, the stations as well. So for me, I think that's worth it. For a lot of people around Kensington, that they didn't want some of the changes that were proposed. So the challenge is we need more lifts. Not every station is possible to have them because it's too difficult to put them in because of the infrastructure that's built around.
Ralph, with these challenges that Tanni's just mentioned, are there any of these that are currently being addressed across lift companies?
Well, I mean, if I can just touch on the London Underground network that we were just discussing there. I'm aware of some of those sites because we were involved in the commissioning of some of those lifts. What people don't consider perhaps with some of the tube stations is that when you actually get to the tube platform, you're a long way horizontally from where you started, as well as vertically. Because if you're taking 2 or 3 escalators, say at Euston Station or something, you're not under Euston Station necessarily by the time you actually get onto the tube train. So the cost of actually installing the lift is not the lift. Multiply that many times by the cost of the infrastructure in order to get that lift to platform level. Because if you're digging a vertical tube for the lift, you've then got to move horizontally to get over to the platform. And that could be some distance as well. So, you know, the tunnelling to achieve that is massive. We done quite a lot of work with London Underground over the years in the past. And that started with a feasibility study to replace an escalator at Waterloo Station with a inclined lift. So there are actually now inclined lifts on the network that are new build situations as part of the Elizabeth line. But the concept of that started back in 2007 with this feasibility study. It didn't go anywhere in the end. I still come across the escalators now when I travel on the network and think, yeah, this is the one that we were going to take out. And the discussions I had with the escalator engineer at the time at London Underground, because he wasn't happy that I was thinking about taking out one of his escalators. But yeah.
It's not easy, some of this stuff, is it?
No.
It's like, you know, Borough Tube Station 1, it's accessible northbound. If you had all the money in the world, you could never make it accessible southbound, because I think the lift would, exactly what you said, the lift would end up coming up in the middle of the road. So, you know, there's this ideal, but I do think it'd be great if there's more places that if you can put them in, it would be possible to do it.
Yeah.
So there are some, the lower rise stations, so like Kensington, that's not a deep station from memory. I mean, that's probably more about the heritage and the look of the station and probably the objections there. So the challenge there would be how to achieve that without creating the objections.
Yeah. Ralph, can you explain a little bit around the rules and what the rules must be to comply with when you're installing a lift?
Yeah, okay, so from a new perspective, the core is obviously the Disability Act, but we deal with that through the lift industry using, there's a series of standards which are British Standard EN81, and there are some sub-standards off of those, and one of them is a safety code, but we've got one that's Part 70, which deals with accessibility in buildings. So if we're installing a new lift that needs to be accessible, that will explain to us handrails, mirrors, sounds, indications, widths, and other features that suit common range of disabilities. Don't necessarily suit everything. You can't capture everything in a standard, but we'll deal with the common issues. There's also another substandard Part 82, which deals with how we improve the accessibility of lifts as well, which is probably an underused standard by lift contractors when they're surveying lifts and that. There are tools there that help them establish what would be the high priority or the important modifications that could be recommended if a lift has particular obstacles to access in a building. When we're installing lifts, that Part 70 standard that I referred to for new lifts, there's a test document that we use to check that what's been delivered complies with that as well.
Thank you for sharing those. Tanni, just over to you there. Based on what Ralph has just said around the installation process and the challenges that you've also shared with us, what do you think needs to change to make vertical transportation in London more efficient and convenient for you and others?
I mean, it's really interesting what Ralph said with all this. I just want a lift that goes up and down and I can reach the buttons. Yeah. I mean, it's really simple. Yeah. So it's easy to forget how much stuff sort of goes, you know, on behind the scenes. I mean, it's been interesting, not just around transport, but lots of other places where you see, you know, lifts changing. And, you know, then, you know, different level buttons, you know, that actually, you know, really helpful if somebody's smaller. Actually, on some parts of the Underground, it's quite funny that, well, the emergency button is at quite a low height. Say if everything went catastrophically wrong and I fell out of my chair, could reach it, but then they found kids in prams were pressing the buttons, so they've covered them. And stuff like that you learn as you go along. So for me, I'd like to see, you know, things just to be more accessible. And I can't be the only person who's been caught out by going into a new building. Well, you know, the fancy lifts where you press the floor on the outside to go in and then you get in the wrong lift. There's a few places I go where they have those. And they're always quite interesting. But, you know, for me, it's just about, I want to be able to get just the same places as everyone else can. You know, I work in a Parliament's a very old building. There's a lot of rules around what you can and can't do here. And, you know, we've got lifts that can't stop at every floor. They've tried really hard within the look and the feel of the building to put in stuff to make it as easy as possible to get around. So, you know, for that, I just want to be able to get the same place that everyone else can.
Yeah.
Target Lifts are proud to sponsor the Stuck in a Lift podcast in partnership with Blacks Productions, a lift company with a passion to deliver expert levels of customer service. Target Lifts are always aiming higher.
Ralph, what's the lift companies currently doing for now and the future around accessibility? Is there change in that?
I think probably it's not led by the lift companies. It's, you know, it's the schemes that lead what's being achieved. be that modernisation schemes of existing buildings or new build, and then the lift industry reacts to that. But what the lift industry do will comply, hopefully, will comply with the standards. This EN 8170, or in the case of refurbishment or upgrading, EN 81 Part 82. But it doesn't necessarily always consider that certain buildings will have particular needs. So those standards deal with common issues. But we might have buildings where there's a particular focus on a certain mobility impairment that needs lifts to do something special. And I don't think that's always considered. So
I think a big part of it is that, but especially new build, it's having those discussions really early on. So, lifts are really, important in lots of ways. And, I do get it in a heritage building why it's not easy to do them. I get really frustrated in a new build when, they've built steps up to the front door. And you may have a lift, but it might be somewhere around the corner, or you have to go in the back entrance and use a goods lift. So I don't think there's any excuse for new builds. And you can do things that look really lovely, but it's a lot of places I work tend to be older buildings, which are, not that easy to make accessible. But I think sometimes there's more thought about how you make them accessible, because not just because of who's there, but the thought that probably for me, the buildings I work in are open to the public and they need to be better.
Just thinking of something there, what I see often is you've got 2 steps up to the lift, which baffles me.
in a heritage or existing building, before the days where this was considered, which is not that too far in the distant past, really, then yes, you might accept it. And that there are lifts that can overcome those steps. But as you said, the lift round the corner situation, in a heritage building, maybe, because physically you can't create the space for it. Okay, so there are some buildings that appear to be quite new build, but the infrastructure behind them, I'm thinking about the hotel I stayed in last night. There are 5 steps up to the entrance of that hotel. It's 10 years old, but it wasn't a hotel before. Next to it, there is a glass vertical lifting platform. So at that point where an able-bodied person can walk into the building, there is an equivalent means, for somebody in a wheelchair or other mobility impairment to get up there without the disruption of perhaps going around the back of the building. But equally, I can think of another hotel that was shut for a couple of years while it was totally overhauled many years ago. And yet the mobility impairment access lift is round the back through the staff entrance.
I've been to a hotel recently where there's only one lift. There's a bank lift. There's only one lift that gets to where you need to be. And it was in service when I'd gone to the event. Then it went out of service. And there was a way that I could get out of the building. I mean, it's quite interesting. You saw all the way. But actually, it was quite a circuitous route out, and there were a couple more lifts and things like that. The hard bit was finding the member of staff who had the key for all the lifts and the security doors that you had to get through to get. So actually getting out didn't take much longer.
Yeah.
But probably had to wait 25 minutes to find the person with the magic key to do it. So stuff like that. I don't mind sometimes if I have to use like a different route. But again, it's just make sure everyone knows how it works. So, because they do, I mean, lifts do go out. It does happen. But it's how quickly you can get them back into service again.
I think, I don't know, maybe I'm upsetting a few people by saying this, but I still find schemes where I think that the lift that's being put in for accessibility is not a core part of the scheme. It's there because it needs to be there, because a box needs to be ticked for compliance, rather than it being given the gravity that's needed. And then in situations where we're involved with volumes of people, of which a proportion will either be wheelchair bound or will still need a lift because they can't use stairs or escalators, perhaps visually impaired, perhaps on crutches, perhaps only a temporary mobility impairment, having twisted an ankle or broken a leg, who clearly need to get into the building. If we think about something like a stadium or arena with clear wheelchair seating, the numbers for ambulant disabled people are not necessarily so clear, and quite frequently, I don't think, considered enough in the factoring of numbers of lifts that we need to get people in, or indeed get them out, because there's obligations to clear seating bowls within a certain amount of times in good practice design, And then evacuation of the building as well, should the need arise, because certainly in things like Stadium Arena, it's not always easy to have progressive places of safety that people can move to.
I do a lot of work on evacuation of buildings, and so I travel a lot as well. So now it's really interesting that people are talking more about how you evacuate. Every place I stay, I ask the hotel, what type of lift have you got? Have you got a fire lift or not? Most of the time, people behind the desk don't know whether it's a fire lift or not. So my evacuation would be very different if the lifts get switched off, or it's a fire lift, or this is getting quite technical, if it's a refuge or a place of safety. So place of safety, you've got a burn time that you're safe, and refuge is basically a meeting point. So it's things like that probably because of the work I do, I ask kind of questions, and those things really matter. So in hotels, the training for the staff is really important in terms of knowing what your options are.
It's so important. Tanni, when was the last time you encountered a lift that wasn't working? And what steps did you take to report it?
So today. There's a certain irony. So there's lots of other options of lifts that I could use. So that's a situation where it's kind of okay. You just have to walk a bit further. But where I've stayed in buildings where the lift goes out, and the first time it happens, it takes a while to find the right number, and then you just need to learn the process for reporting it. Because also I think, if I'm in a building where I've got other options, that's okay. But then for me, it's really important to report it, to get someone out, to get it fixed, or whatever the issue is for other people, because they might not know all the different routes around. So it is a bit annoying when they don't work. But I'd rather know. So going back to the tube network, I'd rather know the lifts that aren't working, so then I can change my plans.
Yeah.
So now at the tube stations, they've got screens that will say which lifts are out, and however frustrating it is daily to see how many pages of lifts aren't working on the tube network, you're better off knowing so you can plan around it, rather than there is nothing worse than getting to a station and then finding you can't get out because the next accessible. So the next accessible tube station might be miles away from where you want to be. So it's things like that. But I do think, I don't know, it feels like it's getting better over the years. But, on the whole rail network, I think at any one point, 2% of lifts aren't on. So not to say they're broken or out of service. In a lot of bits of the network, they're not on because there aren't staff there. So they're working, but there's just no staff member to switch. And what we hear quite a lot of with the rail network is they're worried about the lifts getting vandalised, so they don't have them on. And it's
interesting.
Yeah, so there's lots of things around that, as a rail network, they need to think about doing differently, because what's the point of spending, maybe quite a lot of money putting the lift and all the infrastructure in, if then it can't be on because there's no member of staff there.
Yeah.
So, if you encounter that situation, do you find that there's a call point that you can ask for somebody to come and turn the lift on for you?
Yeah, call point, but if there's not a member of staff,
but it's not ideal anyway, is it? Because you've got to wait there.
They have to send a member of staff.
Yeah.
Or social media's normally quite good.
The power is very powerful.
Social media, which is not really the way to sort it. But if you use those stations all the time and you know that the lift's not on for certain times of the day, it's not okay. But at least you can plan around it. But if you're going somewhere that you haven't been before, that you wouldn't know, then... but that's a different issue to deal with. This station where I live, they're putting in lifts, which is quite exciting because it's a really steep ramp. But they've decided to keep the ramp as well, just as a bit of a backup. It's completely, it's so steep, it's very difficult to get up and over. But it's there for just in case.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, because if a situation supports the use of one lift for the volume of traffic normally going through it, it's a big commercial decision to put a separate lift in for redundancy purposes, should that lift fail.
Yeah.
Or to have two lifts that possibly can get vandalised, which I didn't know was a particular problem, that lifts in stations are turned off
to me as well,
because of risk of vandalism.
Target Lifts are an independent business, and since 2009 they have been offering peace of mind and complete confidence in the service they provide. They are available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and can tailor contracts to suit your specific requirements. At Target Lifts, they pride themselves on providing excellent communication and engineering detail to ensure full compliance, safety and reliability on all planned preventative maintenance contracts. Visit targetlifts.limited.co.uk today to see what they can do for you.
Ralph, can you share a little bit around like the repairs and maintenance process for lifts?
Yeah, so, a lift breaks down, a call-out's made, it's logged, an engineer attends in time. So depending on the gravity of the situation, if it's an entrapment, then, I think sort of most situations would be 60 minutes. Certainly what we'd be looking for. You can't have an engineer there instantly, of course. But if it's what we might term a normal breakdown, then probably the typical is about sort of 4 hours. If decided for by the client, lift companies might like a little longer to respond, but that doesn't necessarily suit the needs of the people needing the lift. In quite a few situations where we're dealing with setting up maintenance agreements for clients, we'll have a sort of enhanced form of response. There's not the 1 hour entrapment, because that is typically a race to get there. You've got an engineer downing tools on another job, making his site safe and moving to respond to get that person out. So having that 60-minute response time is not manageable for every call out as such. But you might have a situation where you've got a priority lift that is particularly important to the operation of a building, where you might have something like a 2 hour response time. So that's the initial response. So the engineer comes out and in theory he can fix the lift straight away, but maybe not, because he might need parts or he might need additional technical experience. So if I go back to the days when I was a service manager in the 90s, it was for a major lift company, and in the main we were looking after mainly our own lifts. So I would expect my engineers to carry most of the parts they needed to be able to probably repair 90% of lifts needing parts immediately, because it'd be common things like push buttons, lock contacts, relays, contactors, fuses. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to today, that own product maintenance is a lot less these days. Everybody's maintaining everybody else's lifts. So one of the large lift companies that's also a manufacturer, a big proportion of their maintenance space will be their own equipment, but they'll also maintain everybody else's equipment. And these days we have more independent companies as well that are maintaining every make. So it now becomes impossible for the engineer to carry the spares for every make and model of lift that you might come across. Hopefully, failing parts are spotted during planned maintenance and scheduled for replacement before they fail.
Yep.
But we're not the aircraft industry. The aircraft industry replaces before failure because planes drop out of the sky. Lifts just stop working. So, if I'm honest, it would be nice for us to have more of a planned replacement regime so that lifts broke down less rather than waiting for parts to fail. But getting back to the original question, ideally the engineer comes out and fixes it straight away because it's an adjustment or a loose contact or something like that. But as soon as it needs parts, that lift is probably off while those parts are sourced. Common parts might be back at the workshop or the office. Less common parts, hopefully next day, delivery to site or to the workshop. So lifts that need parts could now be out of service for 24 hours. A little bit longer maybe if the parts are coming from Europe, because it's not so easy now. Routes in from Europe take a little bit longer for parts and that. So this is why lifts go out of service for days on end, unfortunately.
Some of the lifts have been out of St Pancras for months, for lots of different reasons. But that messes up people's travelling quite 100%. A lot. Yeah.
The type of contract can also sort of propagate this as well, because if it's a comprehensive contract, that's where parts and labour for any repairs are also included. Then, in theory, the lift contractor should just get on and order the parts and aim to get the lift back into service as quickly as possible. It does depend on what scale of engineer is needed in order to fit those parts, because sometimes those parts might need to be fitted by a technician rather than a lower grade engineer. And then that would probably need time scheduling as well as having the parts available to fit. The other end of the scale would be a basic maintenance contract where the client has to be quoted and given instruction for all repairs, certainly those that include parts. So the lift contractor's got to quote it, the client's got to review it, place an instruction, raise a purchase order. So that in its own right can cause a delay to how quickly a lift gets repaired.
I recently read a report, you may have mentioned it earlier, where the lift was out of action in your block of flats and you said that you had to carry yourself and the wheelchair upstairs. Is there a contingency plan for if that happens?
No, if there's a single lift and that goes out. I mean, a sort of block of flats with more flats in it might have a situation where you have two lifts, just to provide the normal level of performance that might be required. If you look at things like the London Plan and CIBSE Guide D, which is Chartered Institute for Building Services Engineers, and their Guide D deals with vertical transportation. It'll talk about, when designing residential buildings, thinking about having an alternative means that somebody can use a vertical transportation device if that one fails. So if you've got a row of blocks, maybe you've got interconnecting doors between groups of blocks so that somebody in block D can use the lift in block E and move horizontally to it as a backup if the lift in block D goes down. But that situation is probably the exception, not the norm. I would say most blocks of flats that we're involved in have got more than one lift as a connected group to give you that redundancy as well as the normal performance level in the building. But there are plenty of situations, maybe sort of 5 or 6 stories with a few numbers of flats on each floor, where one lift is sufficient for the normal traffic. Perhaps we're back to the commercial discussions of the implications of putting a second lift in, both from a cost perspective of purchase, maintenance, energy and running costs, but also loss of rentable or lettable space.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So next question there. Tanni, you've shared your own experiences and certain challenges, but do you feel that all lifts are accessible for all disabilities? And why?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there's more thought with the commercial lifts now in terms of like heights of buttons and things like that, and speakers level of that if there's sort of emergency. So I'd like to think that lifts are suitable for everyone, but I probably do go places where, you'd be talking about quite old lifts, things like, built at a different time, where actually the size, so I have quite a small chair, but, where the lifts are designed for a single person walking through, not for someone, who's a wheelchair user. And so the Royal Institute of British Architects used to have steps up to the front door. They now have a beautiful ramp, which is lovely. But I know there's one lift there, but it's a really, really, really old lift where I don't think I can get my chair through. They have other lifts in the building. So I think there's some kind of like heritage lifts as well. I've got a friend who lives in a very old block of flats in London. And this gorgeous lift, but it's one of those ones, you have to open. It's gorgeous. But again, they've been in for, they're probably like the first lifts fitted in blocks of flats, I don't know how many, decades ago, that they wouldn't have been thinking about, for a wheelchair user. They've been thinking about for someone walking who just maybe didn't want to go up sort of 4 flights of stairs. So I think those kind of heritage lifts, are challenging, but they're trying to replace them and look at them in a different way, and I guess some of those old builders, they don't want to get rid of it. And just, my dad was an architect, so I grew up with the, I don't want stuff that looks functional. And if I've got a ramp to my house and it looks lovely, and we where we live now, we have a lift, and you want stuff to look nice. And that's a really important part of it. You don't want stuff that is ugly. And lifts, they, especially, for homes, they can look really nice. It then just depends a little bit on how much you want to spend on it looking really nice. But, But a very functional looking lift and a nice looking lift, they can be really similar price as well.
Yeah. The reason why I asked this question, I've got a friend that was born with short life of limbs, and he uses the underground all the time, but he can't access the lift. And I'm really interested in when like voice control can come out. I guess we'll go into this with AI coming into the future. About voice control in lifts. You walk up to a lift, you say, take me to the 10th floor, and no one's pressing any buttons. Is that something that's, I know there's certain lifts, but I'm aware that there's none in the UK that has voice activation lifts. Is that a thing for the future?
I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, but it's certainly not commonplace. I think there's probably the lift industry has got a long way to go with things like voice recognition, because we tend to lag behind things. Voice recognition technology that we might use might not be as cutting edge as perhaps Google, Microsoft, Apple, etc. But that may be gesture controls, gesture recognition controls. COVID really started people thinking about buttons you didn't need to touch. Yeah. It's maybe fine at the landing where you've got one button, but when you're looking at a car control panel, which has got maybe 10 floor buttons, a door open button and an alarm button as well, for the technology to actually differentiate where people are going with their hands, what calls they're trying to place, I still think it's a bit of a challenge. We've seen some of the people's solutions, but we think they're still a little bit sensitive and the risk of putting the call into the wrong floor. I mean, it might not be the end of the world if the important thing is being able to place a call. But if that lift is also being used by other people as well, then we've seen them where you get too close to the button and it places a call in for a different floor because the buttons are quite close together. And they need to be as well, because those buttons need to remain within a certain height range to make them accessible to people in all height orientations. So, we have not used, but we have seen gesture controls where people are waving their hands in certain directions to place calls. But now you've got to think also about the training in how that lift is used, because it now differs from how a normal lift works. So.
It's a bit like I was saying before about the new lifts where you press the floor you want to go on the outside.
Yeah, destination control.
Yeah, so that takes quite a look, because I've got into a lift when I go, I forgot to press the button out. Then you have to pretend you want to go out on that floor, really, so you don't look a bit of a numpty. But then once you're used to them, then actually in terms of the buildings that I've been in where they use them, where there's massive numbers of people, actually it's really quite good. And especially for me, where you can press the floor and you press the wheelchair button, so you're not all like rammed into a lift. And it's always the person at the back, isn't it, that wants to get out of that floor.
Yes.
So for some of that stuff, it's useful.
Yeah, so that's destination control. It's not something that helps every building. There's been a lot of destination control installed recently where I don't necessarily think it's improved traffic flow. And some of it is about the kudos of it being a new type of control system and having that building with that control system. There's plenty of situations where it does improve traffic, but there are situations where it's been installed where I don't think it does. And it does cause problems, because if you have a population that's not used to it, then they don't know how to use it. And then you get in the lift and actually you don't have floor buttons in the lift anymore, so you can't correct that got in the wrong lift or didn't press the button in the first place. And also I think with those situations, the disability button, which is the symbol of a wheelchair, which is not the full extent of mobility issues or disabilities. That's the international symbol for a wheelchair user, for a disability, but it really makes people focus on one type of disability, not everything. Yeah. They have some situations there where the screens start scrolling and you have to say when you've, or press a button when the right floor's reached, and it becomes a bit of a trial to put the call in, rather than having the same level of accessibility that you might have if you just had the button you pressed, the lift came, and you had the button in the car. So, I think you need to think about what range of people are going to use those lifts in those situations, and how can we make it easy for all at that time.
You just made me think, years ago I was in Germany, and there was a lift, I don't know what it's called, it didn't stop, it kept moving. There were no lift doors, and it kept moving. And it moved quite slowly, but the building we were in, they were saying that the amount of traffic that goes through, their design was the lift doors opening and closing, obviously took time. And yeah, the first couple of times you used it, you kind of had to slightly like fling yourself in it and then coming out if you didn't time it quite right. So I'm fine because I can pull a wheelie and I can bounce down a step. But if you couldn't do that, just when you were talking, I'd completely forgotten about that lift.
Paternoster.
Are they really old?
Yes, so they're a continuous loop of platforms.
Yeah.
That move, so it's cars that move up whilst a set of cars are moving down. And it's a chain. They move over the top and they go back down the other side. There are still one or two paternosters working in the UK, but I think for safety reasons you wouldn't be able to install one now. No. Sheffield University is one to talk of. That was overhauled probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and I've actually been to see it as part of a sort of research evening, and it's quite fascinating how they took some steps to improve the safety of it. But fundamentally it was designed as a people mover, but again, only thinking about able-bodied persons.
Target Lifts has a YouTube channel. Subscribe and view their recent company promotional video, a day in the life of a lift engineer, and more recently 3 customer reviews where the client gets to say what they really think about the service Target Lifts provide. Give them a watch today. Target Lifts are always aiming higher.
Tanni, what improvements have you seen, say, over the past 10 years in lifts? Any that you could share with us?
I mean, the biggest improvement is just the number of lifts that are going into places that actually, mean I can get in and out of buildings, whether it's, the quality of lifts that are going in buildings or, allowing you to go through the front entrance because they're steps, because it's an old building. There's one lift I use in a very old building, very complicated, because it's a split floor. And I don't think I've ever seen a lift quite like it, not with the number of buttons, but the number of buttons that open the door that side and that side. And it's actually, I think it's about a 4-foot distance between floor. And in the building, they just couldn't join up. And that's kind of quite an amazing lift that, like, really easily, I can't imagine it was cheap to put in, and with all the building work they had to, because there wasn't a lift there before. But for me, that means I can get to every single part of the building really quickly and easily. And that's great. So, yeah, the numbers of lifts going in, especially around transport's really important. And I do think they work better than they used to, which is good. People are designing or thinking about the longevity and just making sure they keep working, because it can't be great for a company. I know a lot of what we're talking about is, lifts not being working, but you kind of want them to work. For me, we've moved around quite a lot, and the last couple of houses I've lived in, we've had different lifts put in, and actually what I've looked, it's actually really important to do all the maintenance stuff, because you want it to work, and I don't want to have to, because I haven't maintained it in however many years' time, put another one in. Kind of, I hope the lift will see out my lifetime if I look after it. It's a bit like anything, you look after stuff, and then it'll last longer.
Well, it's great to hear that there are improvements, but then I guess that leads into AI. Ralph, where is that going to creep in?
Right. Funny you should mention that. I use ChatGPT, and I asked it the same question.
Well, you do.
Because I'd be interested to see what ChatGPT said. I don't agree with all of this necessarily. AI has the potential to significantly improve the lives of individuals with mobility impairments by adapting its thinking and capabilities to better accommodate their needs. Here are several ways. So, machine learning I'm summarising here. Machine learning algorithms to adapt to the unique needs and preferences of individuals with mobility impairments. AI can provide personalised support such as voice-controlled interfaces. So we've already touched on that. Gesture recognition, we've touched on that as well. It talks about smart homes and automated navigation in physical spaces. But it's touching on stuff that we've already actually discussed, voice interface and gesture control. I think the challenge here is AI is about learning, perhaps. And can it instantly learn what that person's needs are unless it knows those needs? So in a home domestic environment, for sure. But is it needed? Because surely we can establish what those needs are and deal with those needs. We don't necessarily need artificial intelligence for that. I'm not sure how quickly it can help with perhaps a transient population and understanding different needs. It's sort of a programmed thing rather than an artificial thing. I think artificial intelligence in lifts comes more about perhaps designing of lifts rather than necessarily the interfaces with people.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Tanni, anything else that you'd like to add as part of this conversation? Any concerns or topics? So whilst we've got Ralph here, that we can take more information out of his brain.
No pressure for me then.
No, ask him anything.
I just know from my point of view, when we've had different lifts in the places we lived, as sort of someone, I'm not procuring lifts, you know, I don't know a lot about lifts. I've learned a lot today. It's just knowing what's out there. And that's the hardest thing, actually, sometimes, is just to find that information. I wish I'd known you existed before we put the last lift in our house, because that ended up, you know, it was about a year's research.
Right.
And we weren't in any rush either, because I used to crawl them down the stairs. And that's fine for where I was, but I was thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to do that when I'm 70. So we had time to do the research, but it's about finding information out there. And certainly on the home side, you know, people knowing the products, you know, the people that come to knowing the products, knowing what works and what fits within a budget. Because there was one lovely lift I looked at. Oh, it was gorgeous. But it was like nearly like the cost of my house. It's like, oh, right, maybe not. It was one of those ones where you actually needed to live in like a 6-story house really to make it. Anyway, so it's knowing all that. So it's actually finding information. Because there are people who want to purchase them. So, you know, it's how the manufacturers can actually just let people know what information's there. So I've learned a lot from all my different experiences. I'm not sure we're going to move house again, maybe one more time. But it shouldn't take living in lots of places to know what's out there.
So, I mean, that's where we get involved in understanding the difference between the benefits of certain solutions. We had a conversation back end of last week with a client who is putting a lift in a domestic premises. They've got problems with headrooms and that, and they've had a lift proposed to them. And I think all the information that had been provided was totally honest, and there was nothing cut out of it, but it was a slow speed lift over a number of floors. And what we pointed out was that the journey time between the top and bottom of the building would be quite excessive, and whether or not that was acceptable. So it then becomes a question about what is that lift for? If it's a wow factor, then you've lost that wow factor with spending a minute and a half in the lift to get between the top and bottom floor. But if the purpose of that lift is to overcome a challenge or a mobility impairment or whatever, then it's more functional and it does the job within the parameters of the height of the building would permit. So I think it's about understanding what are the goals and how we get there.
So we love to end each podcast in tradition, and we'd love to know who you'd both want to be stuck in a lift with. But Ralph, just over to you first.
Oh, putting me on the spot. I think probably a guy called Richard Thompson, who is a famous guitar player. Why? Well, I like his music. I'd love to know what his fascination is with Vincent motorcycles.
Good answer. Tanni, over to you.
So I'd pick someone who, you know, sadly has passed away. It'd be the Queen, because that'd be fascinating. And so one of the most iconic moments in my life as like an ex-athlete was I worked on the Olympics and Paralympics in 2012, the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. So this sort of sketch where it was such a closely guarded secret, and somebody said to me, just wait for when Her Majesty comes out. And it's like, well, she walks out, and right, 'cause that's how every other head of state had ever done it. And then the sketch starts with thinking, oh, James Bond, that looks a bit like Buckingham Palace. That is Buckingham Palace. Oh, that looks a bit like the Queen. That is the Queen. And that's a bit where she sort of pretends to come out of a helicopter. And apparently, you know, so the story goes, when it was sort of floated to her, she was like, yeah, I'll do it. And I'd just love to ask about that, because that is just a massively like cool, iconic moment. I'd like to ask about Paddington as well. But I think that just showed a different side to it. And I'd just love to know what she thought about doing that.
We'll get it stuck for a little while so you can ask all these questions. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today on this episode. It's been great talking with you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doors closing.
A massive thank you to everyone who's joined us this season, and an extra special thank you to Tanni for helping us end the season on such a high note. If you've enjoyed the journey, please hit the subscribe button. It really means the world and helps us so much. We'll be back very soon with season 4, so stay tuned. Bye for now.